All right, let's dive right in. Today, we are unpacking a really fascinating idea from historical theology, specifically looking at life-transformational faith. We're going to be exploring Philippians chapter 3 to see how genuine internal belief so often gets hijacked by what the source text calls a spiritual resume. It's honestly an incredibly relevant analysis of human behavior, taking a hard look at how our constant drive to prove ourselves can accidentally sabotage our deepest values. So here's the big question. Has faith become a performance? Our source draws this brilliant parallel to modern culture, and I think we can all relate to this. We live in a world that is just obsessed with showing off. I mean, just think about your social media feeds, right? We are constantly curating these perfect images of where we travel, what we buy, how successful we appear, all to basically prove to the world that we are enough. But the source notes that this exact same performative spirit easily and often silently leaks right into our spiritual and religious spaces. We start curating a spiritual image just to prove to everyone around us how devout we actually are.
We all instantly recognize the worldly resume, right? It's wealth, a fancy job title, global travel. But the source points out that we very often build a spiritual resume too. Things like the number of years you've served at a church, the exact amount of money you've donated, or maybe the fact that you come from a 5-generation religious family. It turns out that deeply human desire for external validation infiltrates religious spaces all the time. Think about it. When nobody notices our faithfulness, we feel hurt. When a massive donor isn't handed a leadership title, they might get angry and leave. The zeal is absolutely there, but the text asks us to take a step back and consider, is that passion pointed at God, or is it actually pointed at ourselves?
Okay, moving into section 1, the faith that performs, outward action versus the heart. To really grasp this dynamic, we have to rewind and look at the historical context of the Apostle Paul's letter to the Philippians. In the ancient city of Philippi, certain teachers were infiltrating the community with a heavily performative message. They were basically telling early Christians, look, simply believing, that's not enough. You have to adopt these strict, outward, physical actions, like circumcision, to truly belong. They were reducing a living faith to a physical checklist. It reminds me of Jesus' famous parable in Luke 18. He compares a Pharisee, this religious elite, to a tax collector who was a total cultural outcast. The Pharisee stands up proudly and literally reads his resume out loud. I fast twice a week, I give a tenth. Factually true? Sure, but aimed entirely at himself. Then you look at the tax collector. Notice the completely different posture here. He stands far off, he won't even look up, and he simply says, God have mercy on me, a sinner. The text concludes that the outcast is the one who goes home justified. Why? Because his faith wasn't a performance.
And that brings us to a really profound psychological question. Who am I? Really? Why do we feel this desperate, burning need to make absolutely sure other people see our faith? The author suggests it's actually not because we are inherently bad people, it's because there is this unhealed insecurity and emptiness inside of us. We all have a deep hunger to be noticed and a drive to achieve, and when we don't allow a higher power to fill that emptiness, well, we try to stuff it full of titles, giving records, and the applause of other people. But of course, as we inevitably find out, a spiritual resume was never actually designed to answer the question of our true identity.
Which brings us to section 2, Paul's reversal, trading trash for treasure. To prove his point to the Philippians, the Apostle Paul actually uses his own life story. And the author points out that if anyone in the ancient world could have won a competition of spiritual resumes, it was absolutely Paul. Hands down. Listen to these stats. He was circumcised on the 8th day, born of the elite tribe of Benjamin, which is basically ancient religious royalty. He was a Hebrew of Hebrews. In terms of the religious law, he was a Pharisee. In terms of zeal, he actively persecuted the early church. In terms of legalistic righteousness, he was considered entirely blameless. If we translate that to modern terms, it's literally like being born into royalty, graduating at the very top of your Ivy League seminary class, and having a completely flawless public record. But here is where the text draws a massive, shocking twist. Paul looks back at that huge, incredibly impressive resume, and he uses a very specific, borderline vulgar ancient Greek word to describe it all. Skybalon. It translates to garbage, rotten waste, or literally trash thrown out for the dogs. He takes his entire life's work, his elite heritage, his flawless track record, and calls it street garbage when compared to the value of actually knowing Christ. You can think of his radical reordering of values kind of like looking at the night sky. The stars represent Paul's earthly achievements and his flawless resume. The sunrise represents his relationship with Christ. Paul isn't saying his past achievements were inherently evil or bad. Instead, it's exactly like the sunrise. When the sun comes up, you can't see the stars anymore. The stars didn't vanish or suddenly become bad things. The sun is just so infinitely brighter that they completely fade out of view.
I want you to really think about this next point, because this is the emotional core of the entire argument. You cannot receive a gift with a closed fist. Paul recognized that holding so tightly onto his own self-made righteousness was physically and spiritually blocking him from receiving the free gift of grace. It's just a fact. If your hands are clenched white-knuckle tight around your own achievements, you simply do not have the capacity to receive anything else.
Let's look at Section 3, History's Warning Signs, Old Testament Lessons.
Now, it's super important to note that Paul didn't just invent this concept out of thin air. God has consistently rejected external religious symbols throughout the entire biblical narrative whenever those symbols replace heartfelt obedience. Historically, we see this play out time and time again. Take the Ark of the Covenant, for example. The Israelites started treating it like a magic charm. They figured, hey, if we just bring this physical box into battle, we'll automatically win. But the reality? They were absolutely slaughtered and the Ark was captured. Why? Because God didn't want a shiny box, he wanted their hearts. Later on, they did the exact same thing with the temple in Jerusalem. They genuinely believed this indestructible building would magically protect them, even while they were committing massive social injustice. And the reality there? It was burned to the ground. Substituting religious mechanics for a living, breathing relationship literally always leads to disaster.
So when Jerusalem finally fell, and all those physical symbols were destroyed in the exile, what actually survived the fire? Our source points right to Lamentations chapter 3 in the beautiful Hebrew word hesed, which means God's unmerited, steadfast covenant love. It wasn't the daily rituals, it wasn't the golden artifacts, and it wasn't the political power that lasted. The only thing that remained standing in the ashes was hesed. Human nature always craves a tangible object that we can control, but true faith constantly escapes our attempts to box it up into a physical resume.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, Redefining True Faith, Knowing Him.
So if faith isn't a checklist, and it isn't an ancient artifact, then what exactly is it? Our source shows exactly how Paul reconstructs a genuine, life-transformational belief system once that old resume is thrown in the trash. First, it's about receiving righteousness from God, rather than frantically trying to build it yourself. Second, it's about knowing Christ deeply on a real, relational level. And third, experiencing the power of his resurrection in your everyday life. For Paul, true faith is an internal relationship. It's what the text refers to as a circumcision of the heart, an inward, total transformation, rather than just an outward, physical mark. It has absolutely nothing to do with worldly honor or position.
Our source connects this back to a very simple, very practical question. Am I in Christ? You see, life-transformational faith doesn't wake up and ask, what have I done for God lately? Instead, it focuses entirely on connection. Think of a vine and its branches. True fruit, things like genuine kindness, patience, and actual service, that stuff flows naturally when you are simply connected to the vine. It is not about forcing a religious performance, it's just the natural, inevitable byproduct of a deep internal relationship.
Finally, we reach Section 5, Setting Down the Resume. Time to open your hands. The author really invites us here to take a hard look at our own lives and identify our modern-day arcs, temples, or bloodlines. What are the things you secretly rely on to prove you are a good person? What accomplishments are acting as a brick wall between you and genuine, vulnerable connection? Which brings us to our final and most important question. Where is your zeal really pointed? Is it pointed toward your own benefit, getting noticed, keeping your position, maybe feeling morally superior to others? Or is it pointed toward a genuine, humble hunger to know and experience truth? The source urges us to honestly examine our hearts, trade in those carefully curated spiritual resumes, and finally open our closed fists. Because it's only when we set down the performance that we can truly experience a faith that transforms. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this leaves you with something profound to chew on today.